Hi, everyone. I hope you are having a lovely afternoon. I have the absolute honor of introducing our speaker. She's a six-time head of cybersecurity. She's also a volunteer, teacher, and mentor, and is currently head of InfoSec at Roblox. I hope you're as excited as I am. Please give a warm welcome to Julie Tsai.
Thanks for that intro, Yasmin, and great to see you again. I wanted to, how are you all doing? I wanted to take a opportunity, and I want to say I'm extremely honored to be a part of the Stanford Cybersecurity and Privacy Festival. If you had told me that 25 years ago, when I was at the school, that I would be speaking to this audience about this topic, I would have thought you were crazy. But life brings you in interesting directions. And I wanted to take this opportunity. We're at a very interesting point in history, and also state of the world in terms of both technology as well as the obvious massive challenges in public health, and to talk about how we all need to be bringing as much energy and innovation to what security privacy tooling and the landscape can offer for this next generation, this next few years. So just to kind of recap a bit where we are with regards to the current state of things. I wanted to go to, hold on just a moment. Go to the next slide here. And let me go to the next view. Hold on just a moment. And get to the next, let's see. Go to. So what's harder now in this world? We've got a tremendous amount of basically expansion of where people can be vulnerable online, as well as the necessity of being online. We have a lot of things that we have to think of in terms of what we do all of our work online, we do all of our socializing and a lot of our schooling online at this point, as well as a lot of our community building. I can't think of the number of times in the last few years where we received some sort of important tip from friends and family that were on one of the social media networks in advance of official news coming out, or being in the loop on certain things. So it's clear that we are completely integrated with the need to be technologically enabled at this point. There's also a lot, as we are all moving more and more of our real time everyday activities online, a lot more active threats that can continue to proliferate. A lot of attack networks and people with possibly different kinds of motivations are spending more time and more energy on expanding what's possible in terms of how to attack people on networks at their most vulnerable place, as well as how to subvert normal constructs of trust. How do people normally determine whether or not someone or something is trustworthy, and where they can come, and the kinds of natural gatekeeping that we put in place to help protect ourselves. So in both of those venues, if you think about, at this point, people in their homes, their home devices, their travel devices, their phones, everywhere, you have some version of an attack surface where people can reach out to you, and whether it's for positive or negative purpose, and their tools can reach out to you as well. Applications and all the normal services that we normally use, but also bot networks and attack networks that are actively surveying areas where identity and accounts can be compromised. Something to think about as as you go about your regular day, that many of the hardest places to protect security vulnerabilities are not just the pure technology, but really where the technology and humans intersect. Um, as one of my teammates had said when going through offensive and red team exercises, I'm just going to attack the thing that you're paying attention to the least, you know. And in that respect, it's important to stay humble about the fact that that attacks can come from any perspective of not just sophisticated technical engineering that subverts your controls, but also just flaws in process and places where either people or resourcing have either fatigued or been under allocated. Really common places that people can try to attack are social engineering, trying to call up where there are layers of people in the middle, whether they're guards or first layer of customer support, impersonating certain people and preying on people's desire to trust other people and say, okay, I'll bend the rules for you this time. Exception processes, things that are outside of the norm. Those are really easy places also to come through, and I think this is something that beyond just technology, anything that is doesn't fall into the regular stream of expected activity are places where it's much harder for things to be controlled and regulated. Standard things like tailgating, where people can subvert physical controls just by riding along with a group that's assumed to be trusted. I'll go to the next slide now. In addition, one of the things that is the most challenging in our current state is that people are becoming used to the idea that you have to disclose your public health information just to participate in society. One of the things that we all realize now with, trying to come back to a new normal is that for the sake of public safety, people have to give certain kinds of information, but it's also now becoming a bit of a norm, right? In terms of whether I want to attend an event or I want to go to work or I want to attend school. People are now becoming normalized to having to submit public health information and having that stuff be transported across a lot more applications and services than normally might have been the case. At some point, are we going to be looking at whether or not, the state of the public health status will dictate how much people are pressed to disclose more information about their public health, their own health status, as well as their social activity. And I think these are things that we have to, be extremely mindful as we're designing the tools to both help people navigate the more challenging public health climate we're in right now, but also how are we thinking of the long-term effects on where this information is going and how it's being stored, and what people consider to be normal and acceptable for social engagement. The norms around what people expected to be able to keep private, I think, are gradually having to adjust in the face of the new challenges. And in the face of that, we need to be thinking also about how are we designing technology and data collection in a way that's going to allow people to preserve some sense of privacy and autonomy. When we're thinking about like what tools should do when it's accepting whether or not it validates this person is who they are, who they say they are, or whether or not to accept a connection request from somebody or a connection request from an application. What we're often trying to do is trying to distill the things that we do in normal life, the intuitive things that we do to determine trust on who and what context and the extent that we trust. Thinking about making new acquaintances in a community, right? One might absorb a tremendous amount of information in real life and in real time, whether or not someone is reliable to what they say on small things, how they handle their interactions with their family and friends, how they might treat their artifacts. And you might put together a picture internally without having articulated all these things of what you consider to be trustworthy. In the digital realm, all these items are much more discrete and specific, and we have to be cognizant that it's going to be a much more, both a more streamlined but more limited view. And some of the intuitive things that humans do in order to figure out whether or not something is going to be a good risk in terms of do we make this friend, do we engage in this activity, or do we accept this new um, tool or application into our life. We're having to make on much more limited bits of information. And in this context, I think we have to be looking at the instruments that we have today in terms of determining trust, whether it's social network connections or consistency of connections in terms of consistency of technical connections coming from a certain place, from a certain device and whatnot, that these things provide a snapshot in time, but are also limited and could ultimately also be subverted in some contexts. Thinking about some of the things that in this new world, like trying to make those sorts of decisions and connections, the common things that we have, like in real life, that we have to adjust for in the digital world are there's a lot to incorporate. In real life, we might establish like places where we consider to be somewhat public and then semi-public, and then places that we really truly consider to be private. In the digital realm, we are very, very reliant on a certain set of privacy settings and our understanding of how that plays out. You only have to look to the headlines of news today to realize so many situations where companies, especially in the realm of third-party interactions, have a stream of assumptions about what's happening that may or may not be able to be guaranteed. And the conception that we have about whether or not something can be trusted and is in that circle of assurance starts to break down once those ties get spread out among different entities and among more abstracted concepts about like contracts where there may be limited assurance on what another party is providing, and the lack of obligation that a distributed chain may feel for the consumers and the users, the citizens on the other end of that chain. If I go and make a promise to a neighbor or to a friend on something that I'm going to come through on, maybe I'm going to help give someone a ride, or I'm going to help with something in the yard, and we make that connection, I'm going to feel a different sense of obligation than if something is distributed like 3 or 4 links in the chain down a series of contracts. And a lot of those things aren't necessarily visible to users in the digital world unless you go through the details of like, why am I going to trust this particular service or situation? In many ways, those circles like are reliant again on the privacy settings and configurations that certain administrators or the developers might create. And in reality, they're more like public arenas at the end of the day, because things can change or go viral in terms of how information spreads, and certain assumptions about what those privacy walls mean get challenged on a regular basis. Another thing I think that's really important is that when we're making connections across the virtual world versus the real world, is that in regular human life, we might be able to round out the edges around a certain interaction, or be able to forgive or infer certain things. We all know that if you write things down either in email or on on a social media post or a blog or somewhere, and people can read it over and over and over again, it doesn't fade, because people come back to that experience over and over. And while the initial person might have changed their view on it, the way that the rest of the world receives it may be very, very different. The adjustments to current state, like I might have been mad about something like a month ago, and today I'm not mad about something now. Like, does that accurately get captured in those interactions and in those venues? I think that that's something that like we're still catching up in terms of people being able to either dispose of certain data or posts, or to scrub things that are just no longer relevant. Trying to keep up with that digital footprint can be a lot of work, and so those adjustments to all those real life nuances are not as rapid as we might we might get personally. All of these things, to say like when we are determining who to trust and we're synthesizing all that information, like the physical presence or the expression or a history that we know about a certain person, that these are challenges in the digital realm that can be tackled and addressed, but it's information that today we maybe don't always have as much rich context. So what do we do about this? So thinking about identity and the way that we attribute different things that let us know that someone is who they are and that we're going to trust what they are. There's different advantages to both the physical and the digital. Thinking about the physical, there's a real-time efficiency to integrating all those things. In the digital realm, we get asynchronous efficiency where someone can, put a piece of information or make a connection that gives some kind of meta information. You have a point in time reference to something, and people can come back to information later and continue a conversation. In the physical world, we have persistent artifacts that might fade over time, but are generally tangible and real. In the digital world, things are much more ephemeral. They are there as long as we program them or expect them to stay, and then they disappear at some point. When we're thinking about data in the physical realm, we also think of it in terms of scaling in a more linear fashion, whereas in the digital realm, that data can be replicated or transformed in certain ways and given much more exponential leverage. In the physical world, data is an attribute, but in the digital world, data by itself has its own value and is commonly sold and used as it's a value in itself. One example I might use is password dumps in the wild. In the security world, we pretty regularly, look for those things to verify whether or not certain accounts are more vulnerable than others, and whether or not that password is valid or not. The people who might be consuming it or selling it, they will see a value in just having the credentials on its own. And so for me, if I have a password that I have changed, that password, an old password that's no longer true it doesn't have that value anymore. But in a realm where people are selling these kinds of bits of data and credentials, that data is still commoditized in its own way, even if something is invalid. In the physical world, the point-in-time data, the value of it drifts over time, like because we've adjusted over a period of time, and so just like getting one data point, like okay, well, I was in my car from this location 1 week ago, making a query to a map or making a phone call, but today the value of that data isn't accurate anymore, and so wouldn't persist. But in the digital world, that might be in a log somewhere and might be used to help put together a pattern of life. And so that data value would persist. And of course, the integration versus the smallness, the discrete atomic data that we have in the digital world. So thinking about this in terms of what we can do to help build a better construct for security and privacy for consumers. There's a concept of course, of strong authentication for accounts. And in this world, we rely on a notion that having two different types of factors of something something you have, and something you are, provides a stronger way of authenticating someone's identity versus just one of those factors, or something that's going to something that can be compromised over time. As we're thinking about how these things need to be, how we're using these things in everyday world, I would propose that those attributes of data have different qualities in the privacy realm. At that, there's certain kinds of information that is much more immutable, such as my fingerprint, or possibly DNA, or an eyeball scan, all those kind of biometric information that gives that's permanent, that doesn't change, versus things that are more easy to change. Something I know, for instance, One example I might use is secret questions that they use sometimes when authenticating, identity in various places. They might ask me what my favorite ice cream is. And that's something that I know today that I give them. Today it's chocolate. Maybe next month it would be chocolate mint. And that's something, gets to change over time. It's ephemeral. The fact that someone knows this bit of data doesn't give away anything too essential about me, at least in my opinion. And so as we're looking for ways to help provide reliable authentication of people versus what information is truly reliable, I would say that we should consider also that there's a value to having things in the privacy realm of something that is more ephemeral. Even in some cases, can biometric or contextual data be considered in a more ephemeral way? Can there be something that is tracked that gives a point in time piece of confirmation about me, but doesn't give any kind of indication of like a long-term identity attribute? So in this context and today in this presentation, I don't have a lot of solutions I want to present to an audience, but I want to propose some questions for us to be thinking about and a call to action for those of us who are interested and passionate about this space, because I do believe there's a lot of work to be done in this arena. And some of those things might be, how can we use technology in a private and secure way? Especially in this arena where things are as network technologies as pervasive as they are, and how do we encourage meaningful innovation in this area? Yasmin, in some of the, we got to meet in a cybersecurity club. In some of the contexts that, of projects that you and your cohort might have seen, like what are things that people might consider to be interesting innovation areas nowadays? I put a couple of ideas out there today in this deck, but
yeah, I think I don't know if this is necessarily innovative, but I know in sort of the among students and among learning, like people who are learning about cybersecurity or who are planning to go into the field, more focus on studying social engineering and sort of more human-related cybersecurity areas has been there's been a lot of focus on that lately. Like there's been people who have been making social engineering competitions. We've had
yeah.
CPTC and CCDC, which are focused more on the technical end of cybersecurity. But I think there's been focus on teaching people teaching cybersecurity interested people about the human aspects of cybersecurity. I think that's been really useful for us.
Yeah, and I think it's right on with looking at some of those soft spots between where the technology and the human intersect. The technology might be much more predictable to a certain set of inputs, whereas like people like are variable and hence can be manipulated in different kinds of ways, right?
Mm-hmm.
One thought that we look at a lot in the corporate setting is challenging our company user bases to be more responsible and more aware of the impact of their actions. So that becomes a call to action that we might give in the commercial setting, the corporate setting, in terms of, don't think of yourselves only as passive users of applications, but you are stewards of your data, you are stewards of your applications,
Mm-hmm.
and we need you to believe and work in that way. One of the things that I wonder at this stage of evolution is whether the regular everyday citizen needs to also be challenged to think somewhat about how they are stewarding their own data and applications, which I think is an especial challenge because a lot of people may not feel like they have the tools or the knowledge to be able to tackle those things, and yet they're immersed in this world on a in this world that is completely technology dependent.
Yeah, I agree. And I think something I read about was services that are like making human readable terms of service. So a lot of times I know for me, I often give up I sign away my data by hitting that terms of service button. Even as someone who's experienced in cybersecurity and privacy, I'm like, I can't. I need to use this service, so
That's
I can't
right.
really sit here and read like 30 pages of terms of service. But I think discovering services like that make thinking about your own privacy more accessible are really great developments.
Yes, completely. Because when we look at the reality of how people behave day to day, it has to incorporate, are they going to be able to read those 30-page terms of service for all those applications they're downloading or all the implications? They're not going to necessarily know what that one line in page, 27 meant in terms of their data, right? So how do we make it as simple as, traffic signs, right? And I think that gets back to, the that gets back to how are we designing technology in a way that, tailoring for the consumer in a way that they can use it doesn't require them giving away permanent ID attributes and helps them understand what they're using and giving away in that process. And I think there is a tremendous amount of work to be done here, like both in the technology as well as the policy space, because we today still treat people as if they could consume all that information or they could understand all of that, which isn't realistic to every day. And there's going to be basically a, a sort of ecosystem or network effect where people have given away things before realizing what they have.
Mm.
One question that I have in terms of being able to design better privacy and security controls is: does the integrity of an identity require it to be specific to that person? And it's possible that that might be the case, because you need to have a strength of identity attribution. But are there ways that we can think about it where it gives enough of something that is specific in time, and maybe time can be the element that helps with giving attribution to certain things. Maybe the temperature in my car at a certain point in time is a certain range, and that you can gauge that the range of change of that temperature is going to be a certain amount, but it doesn't give away any kind of permanent identity, because like over the course of a week or a year, the temperature in the car would change a fair amount. Surely there's ways there that can also be attributed to people, but I think that like moving in that direction of things that aren't necessarily tied to my physical or biological identity could help move the needle in certain places. So one of the things that I would love to see in more of the security and privacy products and technologies we deal with is some kind of concept of a highly accurate attribute or identity that will also fade over time, so that the value over time from a privacy perspective is less and less, and that would, I think, help in the long term in terms of having large bodies of data that people can mine for people's data. If these things decay over time, over a month or a year, that this value of this piece of information is very low, then the technology can still get what it needs in terms of identity and tailoring for the customer, but not give away something essential to the person. And I think to your point, Yasmin, about what is it that people can actually consume on a regular basis. If it's something that we don't understand and we can't manage, the regular everyday user and consumer is surely not going to be able to do that either. And we should be bringing that empathy into everything that we work with and design, so that there's a better chance of people being able to preserve these essential attributes. So with that, that is all of my presentation, and I'm really very happy to be able to be a part of this festival. So thank you for inviting me.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Do we have time for questions? Let's see. think so. I will say if anyone has any questions, drop them in the chat. Are you ready for questions, Julie?
Sure.
Awesome. I actually have a question while people are sort of ruminating. You were talking about attribution fade and sort of finding ways we can authenticate people that will decay over time. Are there any sort of ideas out there for like what's strong enough to identify someone that will also fade? Because I was actually really curious about that.
Yeah, I think that there's certain things that are heading in that direction, but there's not it's not something that necessarily comes up when we're vetting out a tool or a vendor. Like it's not a common concept that people are talking about, as a factor. But certain things like the tooling, the security tool ecosystem will get motivated by things that reduce friction and that help get people online and using tools much more quickly. So things like, beyond corp strategies for removing friction and removing passwords and in interactions. Those rely on multiple other attributes, such as things like, the profile of the user, the profile of the device, and some of those things might be somewhat immutable. They might be not immutable, but some have a certain amount of fade, right? Like, I could have a device that has certain attributes, but when I replace that device, all those things will need to change. Now, that's not completely, I might hold on to my device for, let's say, at least a year, hopefully. So that still has some kind of, it still has some kind of identifying marker. But I think that one of the concepts that is very well understood in, I think, data privacy world, and still is still working through sanitizing a lot of data that's out there, is anonymization and aggregation, right? So if I have a certain amount of data that gives me the business information that I need, the trending I want to see, but it doesn't get tied back to an individual person. Okay, so now at this point, we've secured a certain amount of data to preserve some confidentiality. Now, on the aspect of authentication and identity, what are those other attributes about me that might fade over time, but might be used in a moment to be able to verify that something is what it is? Today, in the more sort of widespread marketplace, I see the evolution around those attributes of like the something that you have and something that you are, and the biometrics. And I would like to see more emphasis around seeing that attribution fade as a positive quality.
Awesome. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you. I guess I have another question. I've seen companies sort of work on authentication methods that are like action based. So
Okay.
like based on the way someone walks, which seems
Yeah.
close to like who you are, but a
Yeah.
little bit separate. What do you think about like how you pick up a phone, things like that?
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. I think that is something that is like pretty central to who you are. So on the one hand, like maybe it's less telling than a fingerprint or like an eyeball scan, something that is immutably who I am for forever. But those are also qualities that are extremely hard to change, right? So muscle memory is an extremely hard to change thing, and so it is probably, for all intents and purposes, an almost immutable thing. Someone with a lot of effort could probably change the way they walk or change the way they pick up their phone. Most people, when they are in a rush or stressed for time, will like fall back into physical patterns. So I think that it's probably a very good way of providing like identity authentication. Like, so I think in terms of attribution, it's like I would say that I would trust that. Like in terms of like the privacy component, I don't know. It's probably a little bit better than giving away something that's a permanent piece of your biology. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. So let me see. Looking through my notes. I know I had a lot of questions, so just looking through. um, oh, we do. We have a question. So what do you think of Apple with implying confirming or denying permissions on every app now when apps are requesting geo, camera, mics, or even to look at your own pictures? Is that a great way for user experience compromises?
I very much like it for the education piece and letting people know that, hey, there's actually stuff, there's data being transmitted under the hood, and this is where it's going. I think that that needed to be way more transparent from the beginning. So I think that's a really positive thing. I do suspect that people will hit overload very quickly on that. So they might have to come up with schemes where, and I'm sure probably have already in terms of like caching certain like permissions or like holding on to say like, okay, do you trust this indefinitely? But certainly for most things, that first true up of, do you really approve all these things going to these places will be, significant. Like there's so much that's interrelated on the back end.
Awesome. Makes sense. Okay, we have a set of questions now, so this is perfect. Someone's asking, Julie, what drew you to InfoSec and privacy? Any advice for those who might want to explore this career?
Sure. I came to it in a sort of roundabout way. I originally studied political science and economics at Stanford, planning at the time to be a lawyer or a journalist. I always had a really strong interest in civil rights and civil liberties. I always thought that that would be a really interesting place to go. And then as I was coming out of school, which is about like, the mid to late 90s, the most interesting things that were happening in the work world were happening on the internet, just in terms of it was a very fresh time. Everything was kind of coming online and democratization of media and whatnot. And so I shifted gears and said, okay, I want to learn as much about the stack as I can. And before I knew it, I'd been doing hands-on tech work for like 15 years. And not at that time planning to go into security privacy. However, a very helpful VP during an interview said, looked back on my resume afterwards and said, you seem to be doing security projects at every single one of the companies that you were at in the last 6 years. And I said, yeah, that's true. It just needed to be done. And he said, you should consider going to talk to our InfoSec chief. And I said, I have a broader interest. I want to look at all the things, but sure, I'll go talk. And it ended up being a great thing at that time. So I sort of shifted gradually over time. Like by the time I came to it, like the skill set and the knowledge was valuable to InfoSec. And that was also the time that I was seeing that, hey, you can impact a lot of things in this arena. And there's not one area of the tech stack or even, the social and human stack that isn't relevant to this. And so like got to see like how rich it is and how impactful it is for companies and people. So that's how I came to it over time. And advice for people coming into it. I would say it's a combination of holding on to knowing what's important to you, but also being open to learning things and where life takes you. There's a lot of things you just can't predict in the trajectory of your career or your life. And I would say like, know what your values are, know what, if you're passionate about security and privacy, don't lose that. We need more and more of that in the world. But at the same time, as you accumulate skills and get exposed to different domains, be open to just seeing like, even the things that you don't think are relevant can become relevant in the long run.
Awesome. Okay, so Christopher asks if there are standards for anonymization, and they mention that people can identify people from pretty obscure data, and if there's
Yes.
no definition, companies can do whatever they want. So.
Yeah. So some of the standards around anonymization, there's different like privacy boards and privacy certifications out there. And some of the like core things that, we focus on, I work with some peers in those realms in the companies that I work at, are looking at things like, what's our data plan for a particular project? What data are you planning to take? What data are you planning to store? How are you going to handle it along the way? Actually just coming in with a strategy and really challenging the business too, to think about it in terms of, hey, there's a cost and liability to holding onto this data. If you don't really need it, don't keep it, and and that's always a balance in a negotiation because there's certain things that are very useful for the business, of course, in terms of like knowing how to target certain like products or services or other things. So you always like kind of go in with a open mind and very precise way of navigating that. So I would say that the standards exist but and are evolving. Some of the things I'm thinking of, like there's of course, the big regulations, GDPR, the California Privacy Act. California Privacy Act anchors on CIS for security standards and other things. There's a series of requirements around children's privacy. The COPPA, COPP Act for digital identity, how you manage things for users who are less than 13. It's very relevant in my space and in my world. And that, you have to treat that much more sensitively and with like a lot less aggressiveness towards keeping data because they can't opt into things they don't understand. So those are the kinds of things that are out there. And yes, it is absolutely true that both companies as well as individual actors can correlate things that you might consider to be obscure. When people are investigating identity online, whether it's for chasing down threat actors or just understanding a profile about people, they'll pick up a lot of different information about what the person puts on social media, public records of what they own, and especially in terms of real estate, addresses, phone numbers, different kinds of online accounts, and pull all that together. And you can definitely see things from, those kinds of patterns, and as well as meta information, right? The meta information around somebody, like, they're online during these times, they're posting these things at this time, they're in this location at this time. Are they on their mobile device? Are they on their like regular device? It doesn't even have to be directly related to something that you think about. And in terms of the content they posted, there's a lot you can put together from that, that investigative quality. So completely right that like you can put together a lot of things from obscure data. I think that it's true that in today's society it is too hard to hide. But I think we can be very mindful about how much information we put out there about ourselves and share with others. And also thinking about, especially for this audience, the way that we're designing tools in the future. I think that a lot of the technology is going to build the constraints around like what people can and can't do, way more so than when I was growing up. And there's an expression that possession is 9/10 of the law. If all of these technology companies or services possess your data, then that's going to dictate a certain set of things that they can do, and that's going to dictate the level of privacy you could ever hope to have. So I think that especially for the ways we design things, the way people use them, all this stuff needs to come up a level.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So I have a question now.
Sure.
So going back to sort of that intersection between technology and people, I was wondering how, like, what the most effective ways are to get people, like, within companies to feel like stewards of, like, the company's security of their own data. Is it about training? Is it about messaging? Like, how do you prevent people from getting phished and things like that?
Yeah, this is a spectrum of stuff. Also, I hate to say it, but the best way for people to get sensitized is for them to get burned by something like this. Someone gets hacked, they get their accounts get hacked or their phone gets hacked. There's a new awareness. I can think of one scenario where like a particular group, had some things that we had to work on, and like once they became sensitized, they were coming to every single one of our meetings, and that was not happening before. And so there's that. There is an expression that never waste a crisis. So when things happen is the best time to sensitize people to like, okay, this thing happened, this is why, this is how to prevent it in the future. But there is no getting away from doing the constant awareness, the constant practice. I think that like, especially for engineers and technical folks, like one of the best things you can do short of something disastrous happening is get their hands on the keyboard and on the tools, the equipment, and actually try to do something. Say like,
Mhm.
this is how an attack happens. How would you defend against it? Or you try to break into this. I know someone in the business who used to make that part of his interview. He would sit down with the person and just go say, okay, I'm going to go get my coffee in about 5 minutes, and you're in front of this computer here. I would like to see you break into it by the time I get back. And so teaching people to do things hands-on, I think, has this visceral memory that almost nothing
Mhm.
else can do. Like when someone actually sees how easy it is to you could compromise a network by having a bit of malware on a thumb drive, right? Sometimes it can be that simple. And so once they see and work with the technology that's a certain way, and then you continue with the messaging and the tone so people can remember when something happens, oh yeah, there was that thing. But it's a continuing cycle.
Right. Makes a lot of sense. Okay, we have another audience question. So David asks, if you were to sum it all up, would you agree that there's no such thing as a free app or service? Like, are you always paying with your privacy and identity?
I would agree with that. I think that's actually a really great rule of thumb for for us as well as friends and family. My husband has an expression like, remember, if you're not paying for it, you are the product. And just keep that in mind. It doesn't mean that people shouldn't or wouldn't want to engage with these things, but just be aware, right? There was something that was required to build all this stuff and maintain it, so therefore they have to get something out of it. One of the very first internet companies I worked with, they would XOOM, Zoom, before the current payments provider Zoom. This is a different Zoom. Would basically give people free CD-ROMs of clip art. This is how old it was. And the clip art wasn't particularly, anything fancy, but what they got out of it in return was the people's email address. That email address became a very valuable marketing tool. So this something free that they were giving away, like came at, came for something else.
Right. Makes a lot of sense. Oh, do we have another question? Yes. Okay. Another question we have. What do you think about Facebook, Amazon, etc. is trying to do now that these privacy practices are being implemented? Is this like a roadblock, or do you think they would need to restructure their business model?
That depends on the company. And so, it's much easier to build things in right from the beginning, which is part of why I'm so excited to talk to all of you here. Come into things with a security and privacy mindset. Don't use or give away services or data you don't need to use as you're building things as well. Yeah. Yeah, it really depends on the company, and I think that this is where early decisions and not just early, like early decisions and practices all along the way start to show up at this point. Things get bigger and more amplified and expensive downstream. So trying to fix things or bolt things on 15 years, 20 years after the fact of a company versus let's say in the first 2 to 5 years, we're kind of shifting behaviors gradually and shifting exposure gradually. Different outcome, right? So I can think of a few companies that are out there in the public media, and I'm sure you can too, that I think that if they were to really take this stuff seriously, probably need to restructure certain things. Some other companies will be simpler. They might have done a good job of, identifying what are their critical services and data and segmenting things. Being a business realist, almost no place will go 1000% on what they perceive as an insurance policy. And a lot of times security and privacy is considered as okay, well, I'm going to pay in as an insurance, for something bad happening down the line, unless the people at the core are really passionate about it. And so most places won't, and they got to keep the business going and growing, especially when you're in startup or hyper growth stage. So you're always going to have that challenge. But the smart strategy and the smart places will have figured out what is it that we really need to protect, really focus in on that. Defense in depth. Don't count on just one thing. Expect, again, that an attacker, whether they're smart or lucky, will always go over after the thing that you're paying attention to least. So don't neglect a thing, but choose where your high focus areas are. Choose where your trusted networks, your network segmentation is, and how you're managing your data. So it's kind of I'm not going to give a, I think you can draw your own conclusions on some of these companies on whether they're going to need to restructure or not, or how they're going to treat privacy and security. There's some places that will try to do the bare minimum, and there's other places that will try to do more, either because of the public trust or because they'll realize that getting it earlier is actually cheaper. Because if you try to get these things down the line, at this point, the problem has metastasized and it's everywhere. And how are you going to claw all that back without just shutting down all that business? And it shows in the stock price too. honestly. Like, if you go back and trace certain companies, like over time, like people like to say, oh, this stuff rebounds. Like you can see an impact over years, like certain things like just staying steady didn't really quite grow, or there was a recent study that I saw from Workiva that was talking about material weaknesses that get cited in SOX. And those are things that public companies have requirements to say, like, what are deficiencies? And one of the things that can show up among many things, like business deficiencies as well as technical, is security. So if you have a really material weakness, what they showed over time was that, like, the companies that claimed one, not only did it impact their stock price in the first 3 months, it actually impacted it even more over the series of a year, which is, I think, goes against the conventional wisdom that the marketplace forgets, or that there isn't something fundamental that's tied to it. So, yeah.
It looks like we've run up against time and we've gotten a few questions since then. Are you okay to take one more question?
I am.
I know you're super busy. Okay, perfect. Thanks so much. So we have a question from Michael, who asks, as you reflect on your prior CISO roles, have the security challenges been similar across them, or is every organization unique in that respect?
I think every organization you get a little bit both. There's certain things that are common, right? People, a lot of like basic hygiene things are usually painful for people to do, and they don't necessarily see the relation unless they've personally been hacked before, So like place after place, like you're always going to have a certain amount of like fundamentals, and sometimes it starts to feel like telling people to brush their teeth, do your taxes, go, get exercise, but it's like there's all these things that kind of accumulate, right? I will say that every company I've been in, the unique challenges, shall we say, like, are truly unique. It's like the all unhappy families being unhappy in different ways or something. And so I think that you do start to see certain themes of like, hey, like, we need these things to succeed. You need the company has to be somewhat psychologically ready. There needs to be a critical mass of people. There needs to be a critical mass of budget. There needs to be a understanding of the strengths and weaknesses. Are you the kind of company that buys or builds, and all those things? So you need a bunch of fundamentals in place. Tone from the top, executive support, very, very important. And that one's hard. But each place will have its own sort of, its own sort of Rorschach test of how they reflect back the challenges.
Awesome. All right. So we're a little bit over, so I think that's the last question we get to take. I want to thank you so much, Julie. Like, that presentation was amazing. Your answers were super fascinating to hear. It was lovely to get to hear from you today.
Thank you so much for having me back. I'm glad that we could do this again, Yasmin. And we are hiring at Roblox. So if people are interested in a fast-growing, really interesting company, a lot of Stanford people in execs also like helping to build that vision of the metaverse. Feel free to get in touch with me or apply on our careers website. So hopefully you'll see some of you over there.
Perfect. Thanks so much, everyone. Give a round of applause, virtual applause for Julie.
Thanks.